The book is 800 pages, so I have only 15 minutes. So it's going to be very brief. The key subjects discussed in the book can be summarized in three categories. The first category is methodological. The reason I start, so suppose here we are going to mainly discuss the Chinese institutions, but why we start from methodology? The reason is this, is because the way of understanding the current Chinese institution actually is inevitable that we have to look back. So we have to look at why the Chinese institution is like that. So fairly soon you will see that actually the Chinese institution to some extent is quite unique. Nothing should be unique. So why is like that? So we want to understand, we want to have a deeper understanding of that. And methodologically, one of the spiritual leaders academically is Douglas North, who got the Nobel Prize in the end of the 1980s in his path dependence theory, which is a theoretical understanding which provides a framework for understanding how institutions evolve. But here we are not only applying that theory to China, we want to go even further. We want to understand the mechanisms why the institutional evolution is going to be path dependent. So concretely, we found a important analytical framework, which I call that as institutional genes. That is the title of the book. So the so-called institutional genes are those basic elements of institutions. And these basic elements of institutions are going to appear in history. So it's going to appear repeatedly. So here, if we look at the historians and social scientists and philosophers, if we look at their debates, you'll find two opposing ideas. One view is particularly popular a few decades before. So historically, the popular view is that history repeats. So you find many famous people, philosophers and historians argue that history repeats. But then in the recent decades, people usually would say opposite. So they say history never repeats. Actually, they are both correct. So history repeats means that these scholars are looking at regularities. So when historians and philosophers making this argument that history repeats, they are focusing on regularities. But if you look at the details, then of course, nothing is going to be repeated. So the historical events can never ever be repeated. When people say that history never repeats, they emphasize on the random side. So history has a regularity, but this regularity is stochastic. If you look at that in a literal way, then it never repeats because it's stochastic. But if you look at the big pattern, the major trend, then you find the regularities. And here, the so-called institutional genes is those things so with regularities, but it doesn't tell you details. So this is what we are going to work with. So the whole book is based upon methodology developed in this book, is in chapter 2. Okay, the second major point of this major efforts in this book is about understanding totalitarianism. The reason the whole book is about totalitarianism is because that is the contemporary China. When we look at the institution of contemporary China, this institution is a totalitarian institution. I'm going to elaborate this in the next. I like to cite a warning given by von Mises, a very famous economist in the past. In 1946, he gave a warning saying that all of our efforts to contain totalitarianism failed. Remember the timing. I emphasize the timing is 1946. 1946 means the Second World War finished. So at that time, Nazi finished, fascist finished, but he said all of our efforts of containing totalitarianism failed. And he was correct. Just a few years later, the communist totalitarian regime conquered 1/3 of the world population. So it becomes a major threat to the world peace. But here, people may argue that that was in the past. So the Cold War finished means it's a history. It's no longer relevant for today. But that is just wrong, because actually, Cold War didn't finish. So arguing that the Cold War finished is an illusion. So the illusion is based upon a misunderstanding of the nature of the Communist Party, the Chinese Communist Party. So when people don't understand the nature of the Chinese Communist Party, they thought China just a sort of authoritarian regime. So if China was an authoritarian regime, just like Taiwan before 1988, and then as long as China develops, as long as Chinese economy grow, and associated with the growth of middle class, then China is going to go the way just like Taiwan. Eventually, it's going to transform into democracy peacefully and smoothly. But this is a wrong diagnosis. Then here, the key issue is to understand totalitarianism itself. Without understanding totalitarianism, there's no way to understand China. So then here in this book, I spent 3 chapters, and all of these 3 chapters are very long chapters to discuss something beyond China, because the communist totalitarianism is not originated from China. It was originated from Russia. So it was the Soviet Union introduced this, implanted this to China. Then the question is why the Chinese took that. So actually, Soviet Union tried mostly in Western Europe, particularly Germany, but they failed everywhere. They got a huge success in China. So we have to have understanding what is going on about totalitarianism. So one of the important questions we want to address is what makes totalitarianism so powerful, at least in China. So actually, not only in China, in terms of ideology, it's very influential, not so much beyond China. And also for understanding that question, we also need to look at what are the prerequisite institutional genes for democracy, and what are the prerequisite institutional genes for totalitarianism. So in the book, these are analyzed. So then the third one is the major subject of this book, talking about how the institutional genes in China emerged, and how that kind of institutional genes mixed with the institutional genes introduced from Soviet Union and merged together. Then there is a new institution, which is communist totalitarianism. And then the Chinese actually, they are different from Soviet Union, not exactly the same. So then a very important question is what makes China's totalitarianism different from those of Soviet Union? And related to this issue is how the Chinese Communist Party escaped from collapsing, as former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe communist regime all collapsed. So why China not only survived, but becomes a superpower since then? So what contributes to that? And why totalitarianism is more persistent in China than in Russia, where the totalitarianism originated from there? We start from understanding the so-called institutional genes. Institutional genes refers to those basic institutional elements which affect individuals' incentives in a persistent way. And because these institutional elements are intimately tied with individuals' incentives, so therefore, since here we are trying to understand institutional changes as endogenous change. Endogenous change means these changes are all related to individuals. They themselves, they pushed for change. So some prefer to have change, some resist the change. So no matter the change is for good or for bad. So these are individuals' actions. But here the key point is that when individuals making their decisions for changing or resisting changing, their motivation is their own interests. So that is the key why institutional genes are going to be produced and reproduced, why these are going to be repetitive. So because any institutional change starts from an existing institution. And in any resisting institution, some people benefit from it, some people found that that's harmful. And so people want to change. But turns out the fundamental change is always slow. So this is one of the key spirit here. Because the so-called institutional genes, when I introduce that, this is a concept of social science. So a concept of social science means that it must be testable. You must be able to verify that and test that. So for that purpose, we have to look at the characteristics from what there people can identify and can test. So here we have three characteristics. The number one is repetitiveness, means that only those elements which are repeating in history are going to be regarded as institutional genes. Second is incentive compatibleness, means that these elements must be related to incentives. The third is stemness, means these are fundamental, means other institutional elements are built upon these basic elements. So when some institutional elements satisfying all of these three characters, these are going to be regarded as institutional genes. But up to now, these are still quite abstract. So concretely, when we look at a society, what are the examples? So the leading examples would be the structures of power, political power, and the structures of property rights and the social consensus associated with these structures. So for example, the so-called social consensus could be religious. But why here we use the term social consensus? Because we are not only talking about the religious. So if we are talking about the religious, the perspective of looking at the issue is not religion itself, it's about the structure of the power. So for example, in Western Europe, so if we are talking about Western Europe before Enlightenment, Christianity is dominant. So the social consensus is intimately related to the dominance of the Christianity. And the Christianity actually is directly related to the power structure. When people believe what is legitimate, what is not legitimate, to large extent is related to their belief, their Christian belief. So this is just as an example. Okay, so then here, let me just emphasize that looking at institutional changes from the angle of institutional genes, we tend to explain historical regularities. But when we use the term historical regularities, we have to differentiate that from deterministic. So some people confused, so they said, oh, so maybe you are a historical deterministic theory, but actually not. So here, when we talk about the regularities, these are stochastic. So stochastic means that we look at the trend, but there's no precise prediction, there's no detail. So detailed things can be random, but this fundamental trend is predictable. So they are predictabilities, but we are not predicting concrete detail. Right. Okay, so now let's start to talk about contemporary institution of People's Republic of China. So I jumped to chapter 12. I characterize the contemporary Chinese institution as regionally administered totalitarianism. Let me explain what is this. So here, among the three words, the most important word is totalitarianism. So what is totalitarianism? Let's start from there. Totalitarianism, if we have to define that or describe that in a very compact way, that is a one-party system. And this one-party system is actually not only, there is only one party, it's more than that. So in that society, there's no existence of any other party and no existence of any organization not controlled by that party. So this is more precise. So if you want a simple way to make a judgment of a particular institution, if that autocracy belongs to authoritarianism or not, the simplest way is just to look at that particular type of autocracy. Do they allow for independent organizations? So independent organizations would include independent church, independent temple, independent NGOs like Red Cross. So if the Red Cross is controlled by the party, or the Red Cross, the same as the Red Cross in other countries. So this is the very simple test. Okay, so then if we look at the Chinese constitution, including the state constitution and the CCP's constitution, there is a key sentence in the constitution. The sentence is that the party leads everything. So we have to translate their word. So the communist words are always encoded. So you have to decode. What do they mean by lead? The meaning of lead is control. The correct interpretation of the constitution is that the party controls everything. So this is their constitution. So just applying their constitution, comparing that with the definition in academics, then you find it's a perfect match. And not only is in the constitution, it's in the reality. And here I also need to explain a little bit about a totalitarian party. A totalitarian party is not a political party. This is a key point, because it violates the definition of a political party. Let's use Max Weber's definition. So you go back to look at what Max Weber has said about what is a political party. So political party has two major features. The number one feature is that the existence of a political party is of competing for power. So therefore, the political parties are within organizations in society. So this is a part of the definition. And then entering to and exiting from political party is voluntary. Two conditions. And then if we look at a communist party, it violates both of these. So a communist party does not allow the existence of any party outside of it, and does not allow any organization outside of the Communist Party. And the Communist Party bans all the political factions within the party. Nowadays in political science, many people do research about factions within the Chinese Communist Party. Sometimes they don't understand what is going on. So the so-called factions are all underground because any explicit function is banned. So if you organize a faction within the Communist Party, you are under arrest. You don't exist, you don't survive, right? So for surviving, you don't do it. And also, entering the party or exiting the party, none of this is voluntary. So it violates all of this. This is a list given by Frederick and Brzezinski in their 1956, which is about totalitarianism. And they gave a definition. This is an operational definition, is essentially this list. So when people say that the party controls everything, concretely, what are these? So controls everything, what's the meaning? That is the meaning. So the party controls ideology, it controls armed forces, controls police, legislation, judiciary, controls the media, controls all organizations, controls all businesses, and controls today. So this is one more, this is not in their book, data, big data, AI. So AI belongs to the party. No one is allowed to develop an AI model which is not controlled by the party. All the AI developers they have this consciousness. When they train the model, they must make sure that the model is going to do the party's propaganda. So if you don't do the party's propaganda, you die. And then what is the regionally administered totalitarianism? So that actually is a particular way of governing a totalitarian regime. Okay, so this is the overview of the evolution of China's institutions. This page covers half of the book. It started from the Chinese Empire. So in chapter 4, I looked at where institutional genes of Chinese Empire emerged. It emerged from a feudal society. But why in Europe, the feudal society emerged much later than in China and then transformed into capitalism. In China, started very early, the feudal system, but it transformed into the imperial system. By the way, in political science, there is no such concept called imperial system or imperial institutions. Actually, it's not my personal invention. This is a tradition of the Chinese intellectuals. So you can trace that back to the late 19th century. And here, by imperial system or imperial institution, the meaning, the closest meaning, if we have to borrow something from political science or from history in Western Europe, the closest concept is absolute monarchy. But the reason I don't use absolute monarchy is because this is different from absolute monarchy, since this is much more absolute than absolute monarchy. The leading example of absolute monarchy is the French. So if you look at the French system, at the worst time, they still have nobles. The nobles still had power, sort of power, so not very powerful. That's why it's called absolute monarchy. But in China, there was no nobility. That's the key. There were nominal nobilities. The reason they are only nominal, they are not real, is because they don't have land. They don't create power, they don't generate power from their land, since they don't have their own land. They don't have military, don't have political power, and they only had a name called nobility. Since here we don't have time, so I'm not going to elaborate further, but this is a key to understand the later development. Since this imperial institution, institutional genes from there is a key component for the later development of totalitarianism. And then communist totalitarianism came to China as an exogenous shock. The shock started in 1919, 1920 from Soviet Union. The Soviet Union only established then. And then they immediately established their missionary agency called Comintern, Communist International, in short called Comintern. And Comintern established the Comintern branch, China branch, named Chinese Communist Party. So literally, Chinese Communist Party is a branch of the Communist Party of Soviet Union. And in 1931, the Chinese Communist Party, under the guidance of Comintern, established the first administration called the Chinese Soviet Republic. So sounds familiar, right? So if you look at the Soviet Union, they have many that kind of republics. So China was one of the republics. And then later, after more than 2 decades of war, finally in 1949, the Chinese Communist Party, under the aid of the Soviet Union, conquered mainland by using force. And then they replicated the Soviet institutions in China. So up to 1957. So up to 1957, China becomes a Soviet Union. The key difference from Soviet Union is the language. So they speak Chinese, but there they speak Russian. But that things changed in 1958. So the first change was the Great Leap Forward. So if we call the governance structure of a totalitarian regime in Soviet Union as a classic, call that as a classic totalitarianism, then China becomes a sort of a revisionist. So they changed that. The way they're changing that is to decentralize. So they reallocated administrative power and economic resources from centrally controlled ministries down to different levels of regional governments, regional authorities, not just governments, so party-state structure. So there's a provincial level, city level, county level, township level, so on and so forth. So the party controls, top-down controls everything, up to your family. But the way of controlling is different from Soviet Union. So in Soviet Union, literally centrally planned. Central planning in the Soviet way means that it's very, very detailed. So everything is calculated. And then once it's calculated, you must implement. So it's very rigorous. But in China, not that kind of thing. So the central authority has a strategic goal. So the central authority is going to announce a strategic goal, and there is a party line, and everyone must follow the party line. And all the bureaucrats, all the party-state bureaucrats are appointed by the central authority. So it's a top-down hierarchy. And your promotion, demotion, your fate, all top-down determined. And then you follow the party line. But there's no detail, right? So the party in the Great Leap Forward, there are 2 major targets. So one target is the grain yield per unit of land. So there's no concrete way of achieving that. There's no plan for that. Instead, the party made an announcement saying that you compete. So we are going to look at how you perform. And your performance is going to determine your promotion. So then another target is the total yield of steel. So in their slogan, it's called, in the agriculture, the key is grain. In industry, the key is steel. 农业以粮为纲，工业以钢为纲. But there's no detail. So then you compete. And then this competition became a exaggeration. So they all exaggerating and distort information, and then end up with a huge disaster. So there's a great famine. 40 million people died because of this great famine. So the whole thing was shaken up. So then they had to stop for a couple of years. And then the second wave came, the Cultural Revolution. The Cultural Revolution is actually another wave of reinforcing that in that direction. So during the Cultural Revolution, all the central ministries lost their function. They were all dismantled. So the whole national economy is in the hands, if we are not talking about the party line, if we are not talking about appointments of the bureaucrats, then if we're only talking about administration and resources, and then all the resources are in the hands of the local authorities. So when we use the term local authorities, we mean the county level, the city level, and the provincial level. This is terribly important. Why? We are not talking about the history, actually. This is today, because when the Cultural Revolution ended, that is the starting point of the so-called reform. So what is the institution supporting the reform? That is the institution. So without understanding this institution, you don't understand Chinese economic reform. And you don't understand why today's China is operating in that peculiar way, including today when people talk about the overcapacities, talking about the green energy, everything is related to regional competition. So they compete like crazy. And the reason they compete like crazy is because it's tied with their career, the bureaucrat's career. This is the reason why we use this term, regionally administered totalitarianism, repeatedly talking about this, because this is the key institution, this is the key mechanism. And another very important thing that we have to highlight here is the purpose of economic reform. So there have been misunderstandings among Chinese. They thought economic reform is for social welfare. That's just wrong, completely wrong. The economic reform is for surviving of the party rule. So why should I say so? What is the evidence? The evidence is explicit, given by Deng Xiaoping. In 1979, right before any reform measure being implemented, what he said is these 4 cardinal principles. What are these? So the 4 cardinal principles means 4 red lines. So Deng Xiaoping said, once we start reform, once we start opening up, bad things can happen. So then I set these red lines you cannot touch. So we allow bad things to happen, but these 4 red lines don't touch. So no one is allowed to touch. So what are these? Number 1, the party controls everything. Number 2, ideology. Ideology means Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought. Number 3, the dictatorship of proletariat. In the Chinese constitution, is decorated in a way, they call that as a people's democratic dictatorship. And then number 4 is socialism. Socialism means the summation of all of the former 3. These are the right lines. And here I should also emphasize another important point given by Deng Xiaoping. So in 1982, Deng Xiaoping also made it explicit. He said that China's economic reform and opening up actually is exactly the same as Lenin's new economic policy. Then here the issue is what is Leninist new economic policy? The Leninist new economic policy became Soviet Communist Party's policy in the early 1920s when the Soviet regime was in danger. So the surviving of the Soviet regime was a question. So for surviving, Lenin made a huge decision in his own terms. He called that as backward for 1 step for the purpose of forward 2 steps. So the so-called new economic policy is backward. Backward, so what are the concrete contents of that new economic policy? The concrete contents are exactly the same as Deng Xiaoping's economic reform. Means that you are going to allow market economy, even allow for private business, attracting foreign direct investments. And in the new economic policy, Soviet Union attracted the tycoons from the United States, from Germany, invest hugely. So the capitalists in the United States and in Germany actually helped the Soviet Union to survive. And so then later they abandoned this. Then they had a full nationalization of everything, so on and so forth. So this is actually very, very important because these are given by Deng Xiaoping he himself. So when people praise how liberal Deng Xiaoping is, this is just a misunderstanding his thought. Right? Deng Xiaoping's thought is important. So you have to look at what he really has said. Okay, so now let me have a quick overview about how the Chinese institution has been transformed from classic totalitarianism to regionally administered totalitarianism. I believe we have already talked through most of this. One thing I want to add is about concretely what happened during the Great Leap Forward. In 1958, before launching the campaign, the first thing the Chinese Communist Party did is to delegate most of the state assets from central ministries to provinces and the prefectures and the counties. So that's the number one thing they have done. And they changed the rule. And they gave the local authorities sort of autonomy to make administrative and resource-wide decision rights or autonomy vis-a-vis the Soviet type of implementation. So in Soviet Union, whatever you do, you have to follow the concrete central planning. I should be more concrete about so-called central planning. So what's the meaning of central planning? So in the Soviet era, the number of planning indicators, the total number of planning indicators for each year is 12 million. Look at that. So 12 million, very detailed. And you're not allowed to change anything. So it's a very rigid system. So under that kind of a system, all the local authorities have nothing to do but implement these numbers. But in China, they don't have this. So they have only a strategic goal. Achieve the goal. If you achieve, promotion. If you fail, down. So it's very simple. But it turns out this is a way to solve the incentive problems. But of course, in the reform era, it solves incentive problems. In the Great Leap Forward, it creates incentive problems. So the reason they exaggerate that much, they distort information to that degree, is because of the competition. So you have to understand the way they work. In the Great Leap Forward, nearly 90% of the state assets have been delegated to local authorities. And in the Cultural Revolution, at the peak of the Cultural Revolution, more than 95% of the state assets have been delegated to the local authorities. So the only thing the central authorities still keep in the hands of the central authorities, the only thing would be the nuclear weapons and rockets, long-range missiles, only those kind of things. Okay, so then here, exactly because the particular features of this regionally administered totalitarian regime, the Chinese economic reform has been carried out in a different way than Soviet Union. So if we compare China with the Soviet Union, if we want to understand why Soviet Union collapsed, so the collapsing of Soviet Union had many reasons, but one of the reasons is the failure in economic reform. And the failure in economic reform is related to not able to privatize. And the reason they are not able to privatize is because privatization is in direct contradiction to the communist ideology. So then the immediate question is going to be raised about the Chinese Communist Party. So is the Chinese Communist Party a communist party at all? Turns out the Chinese Communist Party is facing exactly the same issue. Even today, China does not allow anyone talk about the privatization. So privatization is a taboo. You don't talk about this. You do it, but you don't talk about it. And they don't call private firms as private firms. They call private firms as 民企. Doesn't mean private, right? It's a non-state. Really, the key is that they managed to let it happen without talking it. So they managed to let it happen without a plan. So this is actually exactly similar to what they were doing in the Great Leap Forward. So there is a target, but how to achieve the target, they're not told. So there's no detail, no concrete plan. You manage. By the way, here I also, since we are talking about the institutional genes, so what are the institutional genes of this kind of management? Turns out the Chinese communists experienced decades of war. So in the war period, the whole communist regime had been managed in that way. So the communist troops and the communist bases, revolutionary bases, they were all managed in this way. And their troops and their bases, they compete each other to expand the bases to kill the KMT. So this is what they have been doing. And that is their power base. The power base is grown from this local authorities. The target is that the party has to survive. But for surviving, the economy must grow. So growth of the economy was the target of the party. This is the party line. And then this target is going to be the target for all provinces, target for all cities, target for all counties. And then all the local authorities are competing to each other to achieve that goal. So there's no absolute number. There's no absolute target. You just do better than your peers. There is a particular term in economics. So in economics, this is either called tournament competition, just like in sports, either called tournament competition or called yardstick competition. Means that there's no fixed target. You compete against your peers. Turns out that this actually, under certain conditions, create huge incentives. And so then the private sector emerged under that kind of a situation. Why? This is because some regions didn't have many state assets. So for those regions to compete against those regions with lots of state assets, how could they do it? They had only agriculture otherwise. So they found a trick. The trick is that secretly they allowed for private firms to grow, but with political protection. The political protection is cheating. So they cheated their boss, saying that these private firms in my jurisdiction, they are collectively owned. In Chinese language, they call that as a red hat. So they have red hat. They cheat their boss. And the boss is happy because if a county cheated his boss is city level, the city is happy because this county is his subordinate. His subordinate is performing better, means he is going to perform better. The same thing at the provincial level. So the provincial boss is also very happy. And then how about the central authority? Turns out the central authority was also happy. A very concrete example is Zhu Rongji in the 1996. So at that time, the state sector in China was in deep trouble. And Zhu Rongji was a headache how to manage. But then privately, he discovered that some smart city authorities secretly privatized the state-owned firms in those cities and resolved the problem. So the only issue is how to do it without talking about it. So then he invented a slogan. You see, their language is coded, so you have to decode their language. They invented the slogan, focusing on the large firms, letting the small firms go. What is this meaning? Letting them go. What's the meaning? Meaning is that smaller ones are your assets. And you decide what to do. So let them go. So I allow you to let them go. So how they go, you decide. I don't decide, right? So if there are political risks, political problems, that's your problem, not my problem, right? So this becomes a central, the Chinese Communist Party's Central Committee's slogan, and nationwide implemented. So since 1997 up to 2005, in those years, there was a huge privatization. So if we are talking about the total assets being privatized, so it's concentrated in that period of time, the total asset in terms of value is the largest scale of privatization in the world. So no any country can compare that scale of privatization, and that saved the Chinese economy. But here, I like to emphasize that regional competition does not guarantee that they always can solve problems, does not guarantee that you always create proper incentives. So it could produce something terribly wrong, just like in the Great Leap Forward. It could lead to disasters. I'm not going to elaborate further. So we have actually rigorous theory talking about the conditions. So when beyond those conditions, things can get wrong. And indeed, things start to get wrong, at least 2007. Okay, so now let's have a very quick overview of the Chinese economy. Here, just by looking at the growth of China and the growth of Soviet Union, Russia. So here, my argument is that the Chinese growth since economic reform is very similar to the growth of Soviet Union since the end of Second World War up to the 1980s, since it collapsed in 1991. So what do I mean? So the meaning here is that they both enjoyed a very fast growth at the earlier stage, and then the stage that fast growth finished. And so then it plateaued and then declined. And the collapse of Soviet Union is in the period where they start to decline. But here then another interesting question is that why comparing with the Soviet Union after the Second World War? But here in China, we talk about after the Cultural Revolution. The reason is very simple, is because the Chinese Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution is to a large degree is more like a war. So these are disasters. The disasters are actually, just like a war, destroyed the economy. So then when the war ended, you have a recovery period. And in the recovery period, it's much easier to have a fast growth. So this is one of the key points here. So when people talk about the miracle, there's no miracle. So after the war, when you are recovering, it's very easy to have a fairly fast growth. The same thing happens everywhere. So not only in China, in Soviet Union, it happens in Japan, in West Germany, in South Korea, in Taiwan, everywhere. Really here, the key is the later part. So why it slowed down and declined. So that is related to the institution. And then talking about today's Chinese economic growth, I like to point out that the official growth figure has been exaggerated. So here I'm citing a paper published in the Brookings in 2019. In that paper, they actually reconstructed the Chinese GDP growth rate starting from 2007 up to 2016. So concluding their discoveries is that for every year, the Chinese official data exaggerated by about 2%. So every year, when you see a Chinese official data, -2 should be about right. But that only applies up to 2021. 2022 is a turning point. All of a sudden, the whole thing collapsed. Okay, so this is another re-estimation by another economist. This is based on the Chinese firm-level data. So they collected the universe of the firm-level data. So these are every firm's value-added tax. So from there, they estimated. And this one, again, also based on official data, but these are official sector data. And then reconstruct the GDP growth rate. And so this solid red line is official data, and this blue dot line is the estimation. So here you can see the difference. And you can see that for several years, the growth rate was something like 0. But the key point is that it's based on official data. So if you collect true data, it could be even worse. Since actually, personally, I have access to some true data but I'm just not allowed to disclose, so I can only give you a cheap talk. Okay, another important point is the current situation. Here, my emphasis is since then, late 2022. So since late 2022, this is a PPI, this is CPI. You can see that China has been suffering from a very serious deflation problem. So anyone knows a little bit about economics will know the meaning of deflation. So put this way, deflation is a disaster, no matter in what country. So once you have deflation, means you are in a trap. So China has been in that trap for already more than 2 years. It's a very, very serious problem. But unfortunately, it's quite amazing that people didn't pay enough attention to this. What caused this? So part of those is the local government's debts. And this is exactly an outcome of that particular type of institution, which we call the regionally administered totalitarianism. So all the local authorities have the incentive to borrow. The more you borrow, the better. So, and then they accumulated a huge amount of local government debts. So this is last year's estimation by the IMF. So their estimation is 15 trillion US dollars local government debt. By the way, here I should make it clear that IMF follows closely the party line. So they are not allowed to collect the data independently. So all the data sources they have are Chinese official data. Privately, some IMF or World Bank staff privately, if they happen to collect some private data, they never ever use it because they are not allowed to use it. Anything they disclose is official. It's based on Chinese official data. So here, even based on Chinese official data, you see how serious the problem is. So what is going on in today's Chinese society? In my book, I argue that when the private sector boomed, when the private sector became the largest sector of the Chinese economy, associated with the private sector, there was a very fast growing of civil society, NGOs. So as I mentioned, that the Communist Party would not allow for independent organizations, including business, including NGOs. But how comes China had that? Indeed, so for a fairly short period of time, it was booming. And it was booming because the Communist Party relied on the booming of the private sector to survive. But once you have a booming of a private sector, and many of the entrepreneurs, they support the NGOs, just like this bookstore is one of the examples, right? So you had a large population of entrepreneurs. They have this consciousness to support civil society. And for a few years, the party found very difficult to handle. This is a huge dilemma for the Communist Party. And they try to control private property rights on the one hand, and the civil society on the other hand. These actually have created a consciousness among Chinese citizens about individual rights. So they start to believe that they have their own rights of property. They have their rights of freedom of speech, so on and so forth, and including going abroad. They believe they have this right. This is a right. So I call that as institutional gene. So these are the institutional genes towards constitutionalism and democracy. And that is the hope of a future China. And that sector was growing like crazy. So around that time, people thought that perhaps China was an authoritarian regime, so no longer a totalitarian regime. But here, the key issue is that when people find hopeful that China may transform peacefully into democracy, the Communist Party understands that very well. From the very beginning, before the reform started, they already set up all of the necessaries. And indeed, around 2005, the leading think tank of the Chinese Communist Party published a warning saying that the Chinese communist regime is facing great threats from peaceful evolution and the color revolution. And the social foundation of peaceful evolution and the color revolution is private properties. It's a civil society. It's the idea of constitutionalism. It's the universal value, means human rights. And so they made explicit warnings asking the central authorities to find a way to curtain this, to contain all of this, because these consisting the threat to the regime. So that was 2005. And the Communist Party has been trying, then eventually you had Xi Jinping being more determined, more capable to kill all of those. So here, basically, if we try to understand what is going on in China, then we could summarize those as struggles of the opposing institutional genes. So on the one side, you have the newly created institutional genes towards constitutional democracy. On the other side, you have the old institutional genes trying hard to maintain the party rule. And the struggle is ongoing. And where China is going to be determined by this struggle. Thank you.
About overcapacity, and can you elaborate more on, given the context of contemporary China, how did regionally administered totalitarianism resulted in overcapacity?
From this deflation curves, you can see that in terms of PPI, the first round of deflation occurred in 2012. So 2012 up to 2016-17. So in that period of time, there was a very serious deflation in terms of PPI, but in terms of CPI, it was okay. So overall, you cannot claim that China was overall in deflation. But this is already an indicator showing overcapacity issue. So why the PPI became negative is because they produced much too much. So then you want to see what happened. Why in that year? So that actually is mostly the consequence of the stimulus package during the global financial crisis. So during the global financial crisis, the central authorities wanted to save the Chinese economy because due to the crisis, all of a sudden, export dropped very sharply. And the Chinese domestic demand always very low because the household income, the share of household income to GDP is very, very low. So up to that time, it has been declining all the time over time. So when the pie is growing, the share of household income has been shrinking. So they are happening at the same time. So without domestic income, they relied heavily on exporting. But when the financial crisis hit, then the export dropped. So then they were in deep trouble. To survive, they devised this gigantic stimulus package. So nominally, at the beginning, the target was 4 trillion RMB. And among the 4 trillion, Wen Jiabao, the premier, said that the central authorities contributed for 1 trillion, and all the other 3 trillions, you take care. So if you do it or not do it, you decide. So if you don't do it, you lost your job. That's it. how do we do? I don't care. You find a way. So, as we said, that the Chinese local authorities are very entrepreneurial. They can find a way. They invent ways. So before that, there was already some regional authorities in Zhejiang province. They were so smart, just like Wall Street guys. So they invented this local government financing vehicle. Before that, they already invented it. So because all the Chinese land is state-owned, but it's a nominal state ownership of the land, in fact managed by local authorities. So every county authority is entitled to handle the land within their jurisdiction, the same as cities, same as provinces. So then these local authorities, when they need cash, they create a shell and call that shell as a state-owned company. And then they allocate a piece of land to this shell company. It's a company doing nothing. They created the company only for borrowing. So they allocate a piece of land to the company and give them some cash, so then they have a balance sheet. With the balance sheet, they go to the bank, borrow, and using the land as a collateral. So that was the invention before the financial crisis. And the central authority was very alarming, seeing that as something dangerous. So they would not allow for this kind of thing to spread out. But they didn't kill them, just not allowing them to spread out. But then the financial crisis hit, and the premier said, you find your way, I don't care how you do it. And then they've all used that way. So everyone was using the land as a collateral. They borrow from the banks. So the original target is that all the local authorities together should borrow 3 trillion. But what happened afterwards? So it turns out in total they borrowed 9 trillion. That is their way to do things. Just like today, the green energy. So they are going to overfulfill. Right, so then because they borrowed too much, they invest too much, so then after the financial crisis, you have this. That's the consequence. So in those years, China already created troubles worldwide. So now it's even more.
Through this theory of institutional gene, how could it inform us about the possibility of a Chinese attack over Taiwan?
Okay. As we said, that is a totalitarian regime. The reason I don't call that as a decentralized, regionally decentralized totalitarian, instead I call that as a regionally administered, is because this is not decentralization. It's in terms of ideology, personnel control, all of those are highly centralized. It's strictly top-down, with a guarantee of loyalty, with a guarantee of implementing party line. And then the details, you'll figure that out. So only in that sense, so the local authorities enjoy some autonomy. Then comes to certain other issues. So military is one of the other issues. So those most important strategic issues, these are never ever delegated to the local authorities. So these are highly concentrated to the central authorities. So including the military, the propaganda, and the police, things like that. And then about Taiwan, the easy answer is that given this regime is totalitarian, it's intrinsically is expansionary. The only way to stop it is to have a credible threat of resistance. So as long as there is no credible resistance, once they find the opportunity, they must invade.
For now, Xi Jinping has not appointed his successor. So what sort of impact would that have to this institution?
Succession is always a big issue for any totalitarian regime. So one thing certain is that the succession is going to create deep troubles. That's certain. But concretely, what kind of troubles, then we don't know. So the only thing we know is that there will be troubles. One concrete reason why succession is always difficult is because a totalitarian regime relies very much on top dictator. And for the dictator to rule, only when the dictator is able to create sort of personality cult, broader or narrower, this is necessary. So without personality cult, then the only thing left is brutality. So brutality alone cannot rule. But the problem is that whatever succession mechanism they design, no matter how they manage, even on the surface there was a smooth transition from one person to another person, but the cult of personality actually cannot pass on. Right? So it's impossible to pass on. So then if you look at Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, who they are successors of Deng Xiaoping. They have to use Deng Xiaoping as a flag, saying that we are Deng Xiaoping. So using that as the cult of personality, and then get together the legitimacy and the support. But Xi wanted to be different, and then he had to be very brutal to kill his rivals and try to establish personality cult. For success or not is a debating issue, but at least within a very small circle, he has established something. But once he has to pass on to someone else, no matter he becomes physically incapable of or because whatever reason, then what he has established in terms of personality cult cannot pass on. So then the next ruler is going to face huge troubles how to manage this regime.
Thank you, Professor Xu. You mentioned that the institutional genes of Chinese decentralization, the regionally administered part of RADT, comes from the Communist Revolutionary War of 1930s. Does it also come from the institutions of the Chinese Empire?
Because of time limitation, I didn't show you the historical map. Historically, the way the Chinese imperial system managed the empire is that way. So let me be more concrete. Since Sui dynasty, at the central level, imperial court have two major functions. One is the functional, the other is the territorial. Functional side, these are divided into 6 ministries. 吏户礼兵刑工, 6 ministries. And then on the territorial side, you have provinces, prefectures, and counties. Imperial time, county is the bottom level of the administration. At each county, at the central level, you have 6 ministries. At the county level, you have 6 offices. At central, it's called 6部. At the local, it's called 6房. 吏户礼兵6房. Then the question is, if a minister, one of the 6 ministers, come to do the inspection in a county and find something wrong, he wants to intervene. To whom he is going to talk to? He always talk to the head of the county. He would never ever talk to 6房, his 房. So this is the way the Chinese empire was ruled. So it's ruled in the sense that always the local head is responsible for everything within the jurisdiction. And the central ministries, they don't have that power to really intervene within that function. So this is a very important part of the way the Chinese empire ruled.
Do you see China possessing any institutional genes for humanitarianism? And if not, why did humanitarianism spread so quickly when Deng Xiaoping made his reform?
First of all, if we are talking about humanitarianism, in the sense of a contemporary universal understanding, then this concept actually started mainly since the Enlightenment. But the Chinese didn't know at all about the existence of Enlightenment until it was over. It's hundreds of years of over. So that is already something very serious. So the Chinese, only a few intellectuals started to know the existence of Enlightenment in the late 19th century. So in comparison, if we look at Russia actually, before the Enlightenment, Russia in terms of culture was very, very backward. But Russia involved in the French Enlightenment. The Tsar actually supported the French Enlightenment movement and invited these leading figures, leading French figures, to Russia, spread out the ideas. So the humanitarianism, in that sense, spread out in Russia. So if you look at the Russian arts, this is a critical element why the Russian arts rise in that period. Because of that. When I say institutional genes including social consensus, humanitarianism is a part of the consensus. So if everyone believes humanitarianism, that society is going to be much closer to democracy. So in that sense, the Russian intellectuals, quite some of the Russian intellectuals, deeply influenced by humanitarianism. And that is a very important part for the collapse of the Soviet Union. But in comparison, China didn't have that. If we look at what happened in China, so the first is in 1956, Khrushchev launched this de-Stalinization campaign in Soviet Union. And the Chinese communists immediately reacted. By the way, the leading figure among the Chinese is Deng Xiaoping, reacted saying that this is revisionism. It's bad, very bad. So Deng Xiaoping was a leader. And then the Chinese Communist Party launched this anti-revisionist campaign. And so-called anti-revisionism, the essence is anti-humanitarianism. And so I am educated in that background. So since childhood, we have been told that in the whole world, there is no such thing called human being. There is no such thing called humanitarianism, because people are in classes. So either you are in my class or you are in the enemy class. So either we are in the same class, we embrace each other, or we kill them. So you have to hate them. And there's no humanitarianism. And this anti-revisionist campaign is deeply impacting several generations of Chinese, including Xi Jinping. So this is the mindset, and I call that as institutional genes. And so if we trace back to the Chinese history, people may argue that Confucianism may have some elements of humanitarianism, but that is actually a debating issue. So in my book, in my chapter 5, I have a whole chapter discussing what is Confucianism, how the Confucianism emerged, what's the function of that, and turns out that that is a part of the imperial system. And the imperial system is designed to rule humanitarian reason.
Thanks, Professor Xu again gave us a very excellent talk.